It was 4 o'clock on a Thursday, June 14th, 2012. Jackie had just gotten home from work. She made herself a pot of coffee, took it out to the garden, and settled in with a British tabloid newspaper, the Daily Mail. It was the start of her weekend. The sun was warm, and the wisteria on her trellis filled the air with a sweet fragrance, almost like a mix of honey, vanilla, floral notes that filled the air with almost a grape-like aroma. Sitting down at the patio table, she poured her coffee and let herself relax. She opened the paper, her eyes skimming the headlines. The Queen's Golden Jubilee Tour, Scandals in the Banking World, a feature on footballers' wives. She glanced absentmindedly, barely noticing an article on the impacts of absent fathers. But a few pages in, her gaze froze on one photo. A young man with a broad smile and thick curly brown hair. She recognized every freckle, every line, even after 25 years. Jackie would later go on to say, "I went into shock. I feel like I couldn't breathe and I started shaking. I didn't even read the article beside the photo. I rushed inside to call my parents. My dad went out to buy a copy of the paper, and my mom got out old photos of Bob with me and with our son as a baby. It was unmistakable. It was him." Bob Robinson was Jackie's first love and the father of her eldest child. He'd vanished from their lives in 1987, when their son was only 2 years old. Despite her years of searching, despite enlisting the help of the government agencies, Bob had just disappeared. Welcome to Shall We Brew? I'm your host, Haley, and this podcast is where I talk about true crime, bizarre stories, and shocking scandals. While honoring the voices of the victims, each episode uncovers the darkest secrets behind most shocking cases. Brew just right to keep you on the edge of your seat. Get ready and remember, once we start brewing, the truth can't be unsipped. It all started in 1968, when London's Metropolitan Police sought to gather intelligence on countercultural protests by embedding undercover officers with activist groups. Over the following decades, this approach intensified. In 1977, Bob Lambert was around the age of 25, and he had joined the Metropolitan Police, also what they call the Met. It's the largest police force that serves in Greater London. He would be following in his grandfather's footsteps, Inspector Ernest Lambert, who spent 25 years in the force. Bob was then recruited to the Special Branch in 1980, where it seems they focused mainly on counterterrorism, infiltrating organized crime and trade unions. Then Bob was recruited into the SDS, known as Special Demonstration Squad, in September of 1983. The SDS was the undercover unit of the Met. They worked closely with the Crown Prosecution Service. It was formed as a response to the anti-war demonstrations held outside the U.S. Embassy in London. The main role was to covertly deploy officers in order to infiltrate left-wing direct action groups. The undercover officers were nicknamed Harrys because of their hippie-like appearance. One of the first operations was surveillance of anti-Vietnam War protesters. The activist group was known as the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. Now that Bob was in the SDS, at some point in 1983 to 1984, Bob Lambert was deployed undercover with the name Bob Robinson, and he was specifically tasked with infiltrating animal rights, environmental, and other political activists. It seems that he was a Harry and would fit the part since he had long curly brown hair. He resided at Talbot Road in Highgate, North London. In 1984, Jackie, who was 22, had just got off work at her job, Avis Rent-A-Car, and headed down to Hackney Town Hall to join in on animal rights protest. There were around 100 campaigners to put pressure on the council to sign up to charter pledging to end animal cruelty. Jackie, she had dark curly hair and a heart-shaped face. She was wearing a red uniform, a scarf tied around her neck, and a name tag, which had caught Bob's attention. He asked her, "Why are you dressed like that?" Around this time, Bob was in his 30s, and Jackie said Bob was slightly awkward. She found him nice looking, but definitely didn't dwell on their encounter. She says she didn't go home and think about him. Around a month later, Bob shows up at another demonstration. A hunt club was holding a fox hunt, which Jackie and her fellow saboteurs were doing their best to disrupt. Just a little backstory: fox hunting was actually banned in 2005. The activity involves people who ride horses in some kind of traditional uniform. They have dogs who track, chase, and if caught, they kill the fox. From what I could find, it looks like the saboteurs use horns or whistles, lay false trails to mislead the hounds, and use scent dullers. And they would use the horns or whistles to try to distract the dogs. At this event, Bob had asked Jackie if she would like a ride home. By the time they had finished, they were all muddy. He had an old escort van, and she figured, yeah, why not? It's better than taking the train back to London. He also had offered a ride to her friends. They get back to London, and he drops all of Jackie's friends off first. Outside of her flat, they sat in the van and talked. She said that happened a couple times, then eventually she invited him in. After this happening numerous times, soon after, they would become a couple. Jackie had grown up in East London with a father who was a television engineer and a mother who was a medical receptionist. She had always loved animals, even since she was a young child. In elementary school, she excelled in her academics. They would talk about her being Oxbridge material. However, by the time she was in her teen years, she started to talk back to teachers, ride in cars with older boys. At the age of 17, she dropped out of school and moved out of her parents' house. Then she would just pick up work anywhere she could. On her off nights, she and her best friend would go spend hours getting ready to go to the Blitz Club. And this club is where the coat check attendant was Boy George. She became a vegetarian in 1982 after watching the Animals film, which was a documentary about the horrific practices of animals in factory farming as pets for entertainment and scientific and military research and hunting. This documentary actually created an uproar of animal activists after being broadcasted on television. Jackie then started attending Sunday protests to persuade people not to shop at the livestock market. In the early 80s, a lot of protesters would take part in violent practices, such as harassment, death threats, arson, larceny, and sabotage. Jackie limited herself to the non-violent practices. So by the time she met Bob, she was a credible regular at protests around London. As their relationship grew, Bob would actually spend most of his time at her apartment. He would tell Jackie and everyone that he was a gardener for well-off people who lived in higher-end homes, and that he basically was a cash-in-hand, paid under-the-table kind of gardener. To make his cover even more realistic, he hired a couple of fellow activists to help him clear a garden in Surrey. He would also claim he had a side job driving minicabs. And just a side note, a minicab is a small car used as a taxi but can only be hired by pre-booking. It's not allowed or legal to pick up passengers from the street like a traditional taxi. When anyone would wonder why his apartment was so empty, he basically would just tell them he wasn't materialistic. In order to stay true to his non-conforming lifestyle, he would say he didn't have a bank account and preferred working in the black economy to stay off the government's radar. It's stated from Jackie's point of view, his clothes often had a musty smell, as though he would wash them and have trouble getting his clothes to dry. Jackie recalls the time they went to a family event. It states, hall hired, and I think this means maybe it was a nicer type event that they had rented a venue out. I could be wrong, but this is my guess. So they had a family event and Bob would wear the same clothes all the time. And she pleaded with him, please get something decent. So he ended up getting a suit from a charity shop that did not fit properly. And he looked awful. However, these aches did not stop her from continuing the relationship with him. She says his curly hair reminded her of Jim Morrison. He would bring over Leonard Cohen and Doors Records. Over time, his interest seemed to align just perfectly with hers. He would take her out to see the Pretenders and the Haunted Housemans, which was a radical bookstore. Later on, she goes on to state a lot of people were actually surprised she had settled with him because outside of animal rights, they didn't have a lot in common and they were actually very different people. And she essentially was just attracted to him because of the animals. Even though Bob had convinced everyone around that he was an activist, he was never very serious or unfriendly. His friends considered him to be someone who liked to socialize and made a great drinking buddy. It stated that Bob was very knowledgeable in political theory. A former acquaintance of his states, he was not a cardboard activist. He had a real depth to him. At some point, he even urged Jackie, who was a vegetarian, to become a vegan. And the term cardboard activist, I tried to look up, maybe this is some sort of slang term, but I think what it means is like, he wasn't just somebody that wrote things down on a side and stood out there and chanted. Like, he really was knowledgeable, and so he came across as somebody that really wanted to make change and would take action to make the change. He would give very little information on his background. Typically, when you get to know someone, the primary questions asked are, where are you from? Where did you grow up? Bob would say his mother had died from cancer when he was young, and that he had a brother, but they weren't close. Also, there were times he would take off in his old van to visit his father, who had dementia and resided in a nursing home north of England. Jackie would offer to come along with Bob, and he would say his father was too far gone for it to be worth the trip. Jackie described something about Bob would bring out her nurturing side. She says, "Do you know how Princess Diana used to do that sideways victim look? He was in some ways quite geeky and awkward, and you wanted to sort of take care of him because he had no one." At some point, they decided to get a cat and named it Winnie Woo. As the relationship progressed, she would buy Bob cologne, then buy him clothes. She started washing his clothes. And he told Jackie he loved her all the time. She later stated, "I always felt that he was scared of losing me, and in some way that felt quite powerful." And Jackie had always wanted a baby. It seems like the next step together naturally. However, at first, Bob had claimed to be opposed to marriage, and Jackie, she was fine with that. He also said at first he didn't want to have children with her. She states, he said that he had a child with a previous girlfriend and she'd gone off to live in either Australia or New Zealand. He said he couldn't go through losing another child. He had even given the absent daughter a name, Rachel. Even though he was somewhat upfront about not wanting to have a child, Jackie could not let it go. She kept talking and asking him about having a kid. He said no. Then she tells him, well, then I don't think we can have a future because I really want a baby. And Bob said, all right then. And whatever happened between now and what I'm about to tell you, I have no idea. It doesn't sound like they broke up, even though she gave him an ultimatum. However, after Christmas of 1984, Jackie was almost immediately pregnant. While she was carrying his child, she remembers Bob worrying about her comfort, attending doctor's appointments together, shopping for baby clothes and furniture. He also insisted on practicing the drive to the hospital, and she stated it was their happiest time together. Then Jackie had given birth to a boy in September of 1985. She states Bob was a present father in the early months of their baby boy's life. He would take him out and about with him. He would also take care of the baby so Jackie could go out with her friends. Somehow, Bob was able to avoid signing forms stating he was the child's father. She would try to get him to go down because they both needed to sign it at the same time. But eventually, he just kept coming up with excuse after excuse after excuse. So Jackie just went and signed the paper herself. And the father spot on the form, which is like the birth certificate, was left blank. And she recalls him as being a normal, loving father. As Jackie became overwhelmed with motherhood, she started to become less involved with the animal rights activist. She was entering a different phase of her life, which is pretty typical. Once you have a child, you start to settle down, and what you once did in your younger years is no longer appealing as you get older. And not just that, but you don't have a lot of time for it. I mean, at least for most people, this is typically the case. So while she's entering the new phase of her life, Bob becomes friends with people who were involved in radical factions of the movement. So just to explain, this refers to the more extreme groups within a movement. For example, they may advocate for a complete overhaul of the existing system versus just a gradual reform. They tend to embrace tactics or ideologies that are considered aggressive or unconventional. Essentially, his lack of ambition began to irritate Jackie. He was already older than her and her friends. Everyone else in the animal rights group had settled down, moved out of the squats, as they call it. He was not progressing. He would be in the pub plotting direct actions. Meanwhile, she's at home stressed about money. She would ask him to contribute more to the household, then feel bad about herself for being someone who nagged. Her feelings for him fluctuated, but the relationship persisted. By 1986, they were spending more of their time apart. She had moved out of London to the suburbs to distance herself from the city life. Although they continued to see each other and raise their child on good terms. So it sounds like during this time that they were still together, she just had moved out of the city. One evening in the fall of 1987, he tells Jackie, "Don't go out tonight. I need to see you." She thinks he's going to tell her he met somebody else. Bob puts their toddler to bed, and she hears on the baby monitor Bob telling their child that he loved him and he would be back as soon as he could. Bob comes downstairs and he says he has to leave because of the investigation into Debenham's bombing, who is going abroad for a while, and it might be difficult to communicate. As soon as it was safe, he said he would write her and could bring their child to Spain to visit him. But she never heard from Bob Robinson again. She really had no idea what happened to him until she read the newspaper article 24 years later talking about him being an undercover officer. One thing I have to say is Bob Lambert, aka Bob Robinson, he was a very busy man. While he was with Jackie, he seemed like he was constantly up to something. It's kind of crazy how much he was involved in his undercover persona. So let's talk about some of the other major events that I think are important to discuss. The day of Jackie giving birth, Bob had insisted on going to see his father in Cumbria. She was a little irritated with him about it, but he said he had to go. All of that day, Jackie says she felt funny, a little flu-like. In the evening hours, about an hour after her mother left her alone, Jackie was in agony. Bob had only returned when her contractions became unbearable in her 14th hour of labor. He had rode with her in the ambulance to the hospital. He insisted he had to see his father that day. And now I don't know if this is for sure, but it was stated that he was seeing his real wife and children in Herefordshire. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I definitely don't think I am. At some point in 1985, Bob attended an event outside of Murray's Meat Market, where graphic leaflets were handed out. Bob is arrested under the identity of Bob Robinson, and it was revealed later on that he had made at least one appearance under the false name in Camberwell Magistrates Court. So once all the information came out later that he was an undercover officer, a lot of people were asking if he was going to be prosecuted for perjury. And if you're unaware, perjury is the act of intentionally making a false statement under oath or signing a legal document that is false. Bob Lambert was a master of undercover work. He was able to persuade activists that he was useful, and he gradually worked his way deeper into the community. He had given others the impression he was doing a lot of direct action without giving too many details. Mr. Gravitt said, "Let it be known that he dabbled in illegal protests." He stated that Bob had told him of a time he dressed up as a jogger and poured paint stripper over the car of a director of an animal testing laboratory. Whether this was true or not, it helped Bob portray himself as a real revolutionist. This would help him penetrate the hardcore wing of the animal rights movement known as Animal Liberation Front, which I will refer to as ALF. The ALF, established in Great Britain in the mid-1970s, is a loosely organized extremist movement committed to ending the abuse and exploitation of animals. They were known for extreme acts of sabotage that had caused millions of pounds in damages. The police actually viewed the group as an underground terrorist network. The campaigners would disguise themselves wearing black baklavas and camouflage jackets. The ALF had no membership and no leaders. They worked through a network of small activist groups. With no structure, this caused followers to work in a fluid, loose way, meaning they could come together to execute a direct action and then quickly disperse without really getting caught very quickly. The special squad was set up in order to catch the ALF campaigners by the special branch. By the 90s, they had around 100 informants in animal rights groups. One way he had made himself useful to others is he drove protesters from around the country to support fellow ALF activists who were being prosecuted. When others were put on trial and eventually prosecuted for conspiracy to commit arson, they were sent to jail for 10 years. Bob even complained that the sentence was too harsh and agreed that since those two were jailed, that hey, we should carry on more attacks. Another way he proved himself to his comrades was he came up with a very well-known ALF flyer, which had the philosophy, you wouldn't leave it to others if your friend was being beaten up in the street. In the same way, you can't stand by as thousands of animals are slaughtered every day. This approach then led the ALF to start a campaign aimed at companies that sold animal products, such as Debenhams, House of Fraser, and Alders, which all sold fur products. This gave Bob the opportunity to really make a name for himself. Over 3 years from 1984, activists planted more than 40 incendiary devices in order to set fire to these stores. Incendiary devices are weapons designed to set fire or burn things. They work by using a chemical reaction to produce either heat or flames containing flammable substances, such as specific chemicals that I will not get into. Typically, the chemical is in a bottle with some sort of material stuffed in the top of the bottle. The media called the attacks firebombs, but these were just homemade devices that were not actual explosives. The activists' devices were the size of cigarette boxes, and they would place them under flammable objects like a chair or maybe by the clothes. The devices were designed to go off at night in order not to harm any innocent bystanders. They would lay them out in the afternoon, and they would typically ignite just a little after midnight. Their goal was to set a big enough fire so the sprinkler system would go off, flood the store, and ruin the stocks of the products. Now, how far would one undercover cop go in order to prove himself to other activists in order to take them down? An accomplice of Bob's, Jeff Shepard, talks about the time in 1987 when the trio, Jeff, Bob, and Andrew, got together and concocted a plan. They experimented with their flammable devices, but made a decision to improve it. They would assemble their device in an empty property around London. Just, kind of test it out, I guess. Their plan was to target 3 locations of Debenhams stores. The trio collected 2 devices during the day on Saturday, July 11th, and then they headed off to their Debenhams location. The store's locations were one in Luton, one in Harrow, and one in Romford. Jeff returned from his designated store location. He turns on the radio and listens to BBC World Service. It was then announced 3 Debenhams stores had been subjected to arson attacks, including the one in Harrow. So Jeff knew Bob had done his store. He recalls Bob explaining to him how he had been able to place one device but not the other. However, Bob repeatedly denies that he had anything to do with the arson. One really big problem, except for the fact they're lighting stores on fire, is that on that specific night, the sprinkler system in Luton had been turned off to be repaired. So there's nothing to extinguish what would start as a small fire. Firefighters discovered it at 1:50 a.m. the next morning. It took 80 firefighters who had to pump water from 10 fire trucks to 6:39 a.m. to control the fire. The photo of the aftermath just looks like rubble, like aftermath from an earthquake. Later on, the 2 other men, Jeff Shepard and Andrew Clark, were arrested. In May 1987, Bob had met 24-year-old Belinda Harvey at a party in Tottenham. They would soon start an intimate relationship. He would spend a lot of time at an East London house that he shared with 7 others. So by the summer in 1987, he was in a relationship with his real wife, as Bob Lambert, and the long-term relationship with Jackie, which was kind of fizzling out by this point, and now with Belinda. Belinda also had wanted to stay anonymous for a while, so some sources and articles refer to her as Karen or Jenny. Belinda says she was intrigued with Bob. She states he was polite, considerate, very romantic, attentive, and charismatic. He smiled a lot, and he was non-judgmental. Bob and Belinda would go on to have an 18-month relationship. When she tried to persuade him to settle down and have a family together, he resisted. He claimed he had to flee abroad as he was being pursued by the special branch because he was a dangerous radical activist. Bob made sure Jackie and Belinda never met each other. He told Belinda that his son, the one that he had with Jackie, he tells Belinda that he was the result of a brief fling with a woman who tricked him into having a baby. He claimed Jackie would say she was on the pill when she was not. Whenever he picked his son up from Jackie, he made sure that Karen stayed in the van parked around the corner. Apparently, there was a reason for Bob to be in both of these relationships. They would become useful when he was nearing the end of his deployment. You see, every undercover officer needs a valid and believable excuse in order to disappear. These women would be close enough to him to vouch for his disappearance. After the two men who were involved with setting a blaze to Debenhams were arrested, Bob would be sure to tell people he was worried that he would be arrested and charged along with Jeff and Andrew, which the SDS helped Bob pull off a ruse to convince his friends that his worries were justified. By the time Belinda had moved into an apartment in a high-rise with two friends, on one early morning, the detectives raided the flat, letting it slip that they were looking for Bob. And he was not there, neither was Karen, but the news was spreading quickly that they were on the hunt for him. So this raid was fake and was a trick to make the cover story all that more believable. Bob had told Belinda before the raid that he would have to make himself scarce and go on the run, which she wanted to join him. And he told her she should not waste her life as a fugitive. Now, let's fast forward a bit to 2012 again, when Jackie had discovered Bob's face looking back at her in the newspaper article photo. She had called her parents to confirm that the man was indeed Bob Robinson. The next morning, in disbelief, she starts typing into the Google search bar, Bob Lambert, father-child. She found pictures of Bob showing him as a young man and now as a thin, gray-haired man with the same startling eyes. She ended up staying late into the night trying to gather and, I'm sure, just process all the information that she was finding. She had found herself on The Guardian reading articles on how former activists had unmasked Bob Lambert as a spy. The information overwhelmed both Jackie and Belinda. Jackie states her life fell apart that day. Her mental health had suffered, and she went to a psychiatrist every Tuesday for 12 weeks. She also called Bob once she was able to talk to him for the first time in 24 years. She understandably had so many questions. She asked him, "Why me?" And she says that he also sounded very emotional, and he couldn't answer any of her questions, even though she had many. She wanted to know if the force chose her or if he did. She also wanted to know if the force had chosen to abandon her and their son, or if he did. His answers didn't help. They gave her more questions and really counted for nothing. After all, she can't believe anything that he's saying. She couldn't figure out why she was chosen by the state to be treated this way. She was not a threat to national security, and she asked, "What was my child? Collateral damage?" She had come to find out while Bob Robinson was in Spain, Bob Lambert had really been several miles away sitting behind a desk. He really hadn't made an effort to maintain his cover. He went on to become a lecturer in terrorism studies at St. Andrews University. He published a book in 2011 and publicly spoke at a conference about extreme political violence in front of an audience of about 400 people. During the Q&A, a man stood up with his hand raised and asked, "I have one question from the floor. David Morris, London Greenpeace. Is he going to apologize for organizing disgusting undercover police infiltration of campaign groups, including anti-fascists in my own group, London Greenpeace, for 5 years as Bob Robinson?" Other activists who attended with the man started shouting from the floor. They're all pressing Bob to apologize. When Bob leaves the building, they follow him onto the street, tailing behind him while recording a video.
"We'd like to talk to you about your infiltration of London Greenpeace and your abuse of female campaigners."
Bob starts walking faster and faster while he's being pressed for answers. He says nothing. He turns in the street going through traffic and just makes a run for it. I'm sure, as you can imagine, Jackie is spiraling. She's pressing Bob for more answers, and she asks him if their son had any brothers or sisters. A woman came on the line and introduced herself as Bob's wife. I guess she took the phone because Bob was upset. Both of his children had died. A daughter passed away when she was 17, and his son had passed away. And both of these children were with his previous wife. So he was married to the mother of his children and then married to this wife who answers the phone. Jackie ultimately describes the betrayal and deceit as
It's like being raped by the state.
Belinda stated,
My phone's hacked. Well, that's nothing compared to what happened to me. It's like our bodies were hacked.
By December of 2011, a group of 8 women who were deceived into long-term intimate relationships by Lambert and 4 other male undercover officers began legal proceedings against the Met. And more misconduct had been uncovered. In court cases involving the prosecution of activists, the undercover officers and their supervisors had concealed vital evidence that could have resulted in their acquittals. So far, it is known that at least 50 protesters have been wrongly convicted or prosecuted because evidence relating to the activities of the police spies had been unfairly buried in the legal proceedings. However, the Crown Prosecution Service ultimately decided not to proceed with the charges in relation to alleged sexual misconduct, such as rape against Bob. And I think this story kind of raises some questions, like, what are the human cost of these type of operations? The undercover officers started relationships without telling women their real identity. That's key because it means that the women weren't able to give their consent. Had they known who the person really was, and if they knew they were officers, they would have said no. And the officers' managers essentially turned a blind eye, or they encouraged it because they thought this is the way of getting information. Bob's son was also affected by not having a present father. He was 26 years old once he discovered who his father was. His son claims in the lawsuit he suffered psychiatric damage. He said he had yearned to have a father when he was growing up and now felt that his birth and childhood had been based on a lie, causing him confusion and distress. Essentially, the Met did not answer any of the son's questions and ended up just paying him for the damages and apologizing. Did you ever wonder, where did they come up with these fake names for their cover? Well, one SDS trick was for the officers to choose a child with a middle name that they shared. Not just any child. The names of children who had passed away. Bob Lambert, who used the name of Bob Robinson, took the identity of Mark Robert Robinson, who was born in Plumstead, southeast London on February 28, 1952. Officers would always look for children who were born around the same time as them. And Bob's choice was ideal since the other child was born just 16 days before Bob's real birthday. Mark Robinson had died at the age of 7 after being born with a malformed heart. His cause of death was acute congestive cardiac failure. The officers would often go visit deceased children's headstones at cemeteries to really make sure they familiarize themselves with the lives of the people they were pretending to be. They would visit the house where the child was born and where that child spent like maybe their first few years of life. They would get to know all the little details, the ones that really matter, like the smell coming out of the drain that has been broken for years, the bus number you would take to and from that location. They would memorize the names of the dead child's mother, father, siblings, and any other relatives. And they found ways to work these details into their own backstory. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, this became a massive ethical problem. Robert Lambert's story raises questions about the nature of deception. When deception is a matter of policy, where does accountability lie? And for those who were deceived, is there ever a way to make things right? In my personal opinion, I don't think so. Especially out of this specific case. These women thought that they were in a long-term relationship. They could not give their consent. Their bodies were used, and one woman had a child and was left to live the single mother life and take care of this child. And then the devastation put on the child growing up without a father. It's like I could not stop thinking about this case as soon as I heard about it. And the more details that I uncovered, it was just, it's crazy. But as always, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this case. Comment below and let me know what you think. I'm really eager to keep the conversation going with this one. Thank you all so much for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.